I want to talk about poppies. Just occasionally one can come across a field like that, and that field is obviously full of poppies. And I suspect and I hope that all of you recognized it. It's one of our most recognizable plants, and it's one which is actually identifiable from more than a mile away. One of the very, very few that can be. And it can turn an entire field like that. This was actually taken by a friend of mine about 10 years ago. And it's in Wiltshire. But I don't know how often you've seen one recently. You've probably not seen very many fields of poppies like that recently. I certainly haven't. But it's a very wonderful sight when you do. They used to be common, fields like that. Okay, you can still see poppies. There are poppies all around the fields. You can see them on the tracks. You can see them in the bits of waste ground and things. There are still quite a lot of poppies about. But do you think, for instance, that here we are in October, when it comes to next month, we will all hopefully be buying a little poppy to put in our lapels? Do you think it would ever have become the symbol of the war dead if it had not been a very common and, of course, very recognizable plant? Yes, it came up where the soldiers had been killed in the First World War, and that's why it became the symbol that it did, something that we all recognize, the poppy appeal. And so poppies then are still common, luckily, but not doing what they used to. Poppies hadn't been like that. People like Monet wouldn't have been able to paint a picture like that. It's one of the best known, one of the most popular artists perhaps we have. Monet, the great impressionist, inventor indeed of Impressionism. Where would Monet be without poppies? Poppies in this one, actually he calls it les coquelicots, the poppies. Coquelicot, a coxcomb, rather a nice French way of saying poppy. And he put it in a whole lot of other pictures as well. In fact, even the ones that he didn't call the poppies, they're in the landscapes. You see a red splodge somewhere, which is always poppies. One of the most noticeable features of our agricultural landscape. But one of the interesting things is, have you ever seen a poppy outside the agricultural landscape? Or perhaps agricultural related? Where do poppies live anywhere that isn't agricultural? And then we think to ourselves, well, no, it doesn't. It's always an agricultural landscape. So where was it before there was agriculture? In this country, in fact, in most of Europe, there wasn't agriculture before sort of 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, which in the life of a plant is nothing much at all. So what happened? Well, these plants, we now have good evidence, these plants spread from the Middle East, which is where agriculture started, and they spread gradually across Europe. They came with agriculture. They came with the fields of wheat and barley and such like, and they then colonized. The weeds came with us. They came with us with agricultural people. So they were introduced into this country. Of course, they weren't always loved, but they were introduced by us. And we have a nice name for it now. We know them as archaeophytes, rather a nice term, the ancient plants. Of course, nothing like as ancient as our native plants, but they're known as the archaeophytes, ancient introductions which came here with agriculture. And if we look at the distribution of the common poppy now, that's what we see. This and the other maps have been taken from the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland online atlas. And so it's up to date, this is where they are now. And you can see there's a lot of blue dots all over the country. But you can see just a few ominous pink ones. Those pink dots are where it's disappeared completely from that square. The thing is, the blue dot only means that just one poppy is enough. It doesn't have to be a whole field of poppies. And they've gone, even in many places within those blue squares, they've gone completely from some of the others. It doesn't like upland Britain much, as you can see from that slide, but you can see there where the poppy has been. If I shift attention now to another cornfield weed, this one perhaps not quite so well known, but just as lovely. There's the odd poppy you can see in there, but this is the cornflower. Some of you, I hope, would recognize the cornflower. The cornflower, this wonderful blue color, used to be fairly widespread within this country, and again has declined quite considerably. The cornflower, in fact, became the symbol that the French used in place of the poppy for their war dead, largely because their people in the First World War, the uniform, was what they called horizon blue, and it became known as les bleuets, which was actually the same name that they use for the cornflower, the blue one. And so they actually used the cornflower as their symbol. Now, cornflowers, again, a map where you can see much less widespread than the poppy, still there, although I have to say that a number of these blue spots on this particular one will almost certainly be introductions in seed mixes. People like cornflowers, and you can see what it looks like. Of course, you'd expect people to like cornflowers. They're lovely plants. Rank weeds that every art and care defy, reign o'er the land and rob the blighted rye. Their thistles stretch their prickly arms afar, and to the ragged infant threaten war. Their poppies, nodding, mock the hope of toil. There the blue bugloss paints the sterile soil. Hardy and high above the slender sheaf, the slimy mallow weaves her silky leaf. O'er the young shoot, the charlock throws a shade, and the wild tare clings round the sickly blade. Crabbe is complaining about these weeds. In the Village, which you can see was written in 1783. Now, he's complaining about them. Of course, people didn't like these weeds. They had to get rid of the weeds. Getting rid of the weeds was important because the weeds were taking away from their crop. They were spoiling their harvest. It just wasn't, they weren't as good. They were taking some of the nutrients from the soil, and the harvesting was going to be more difficult. He was complaining about him, but, and you can see this very clearly from this poem, he thought everybody knew what these things were. These were familiar plants. These were the plants that people knew, because back in the 1780s and before, a much larger proportion of people worked on the land. Now it's a very, very small proportion, but they worked on the land. These were the plants that people knew. These were plants that people were familiar with. Yes, of course, they pulled them out. Yes, of course, they tried to get rid of them in their crops, but they knew them. They knew what they were. They were part of their lives, and that was important to them all. There's one of them, the blue bugloss, the small bugloss. It's a cornfield weed, just like the poppy and the cornflower, but it's nothing like as common, and it's much less conspicuous. Lovely color though it is. It's got a very small flower. Its distribution is still fairly widespread, as you can see, but you're beginning to see rather more of those colored spots. The pink ones disappeared since 2000. The other ones disappeared earlier. We're beginning to see quite a lot of those turning up with the blue bugloss. And here's another. This is the corn buttercup. And some of these things do have nice names. This one of the main folk names of this plant is the devil's claw. And you can see there, that's why. The seed head of the corn buttercup has this wonderful claw-like sort of pieces on the fruit there. The corn buttercup is a small flowered buttercup, and it was a buttercup which I knew in my childhood in the 1960s. It was there in the fields next to where I was brought up, and I knew it, and I saw it, and I, like all these things, amongst many other cornfield weeds. But if we look at the distribution of the corn buttercup now, we're beginning to see, unfortunately, a rather depressing sight. There are very few blue dots for the corn buttercup. That's where it still occurs. It's in a few places, yes, but there's an awful lot of pink ones and green ones, particularly more green ones and brown ones, disappeared since 1970. This plant has declined hugely. Yes, it's not as obviously attractive as a poppy or a cornflower. No, it isn't. But it's there. It's part of what we were brought up with in farmland, or at least part of our, as it were, cultural background, really, in the cornfields. And then there's this one. This is another plant, even sadder. This one's got another lovely name. It's called the swine's succory. Unusual name. Sometimes known as the lamb's succory. Evidently, swine and lambs evidently liked it. The swine's succory. And the swine's succory is actually extinct in this country. It actually disappeared completely. Okay, it was never common. I accept it was never common. You can see that the yellow dots are, they were there in 1930. Just a few green and brown dots. It actually went extinct completely. The one blue dot that you can see in Northern England there is a reintroduction. It has been brought in specially because people were concerned, just a few people at least, were concerned that this plant had disappeared altogether from our farmland. To go back to something slightly better known, that one, I tried this on some of my colleagues, by the way, and some of them, they didn't actually know what they were either. So if you don't know what these are, then you're in some quite good company. That's the corn cockle. That's the corn cockle. A well-known plant, a very well-known plant for some of the wrong reasons. The corn cockle is very pretty, as you can see there. It produces seeds which are fairly large. They're about sort of 3 millimeters or so across, shaped very beautifully. They're black, and they're shaped like a minute cockle, hence the name. The trouble is, if they got into your bread, if they were harvested, for instance, with the wheat, then they would turn your bread a sort of bluey-grey color, and even more unfortunately, it was a little poisonous. So not very nice to find in your bread. So the corn cockle was particularly disliked by people, however pretty it may be. So the corn cockle then disappeared from our country. And like the swine suckery, although this was much, much commoner, this one disappeared altogether from this country. But people do like it, they do think it's nice, and when I look at the atlas from the Botanical Society, you can see actually there are quite a lot of blue spots. Every single one of those is a product of a seed mix. Perhaps it's a little bit of a redressing of the balance that we can actually see these things actually coming back in a few places, even if artificially. But that's got to be better than nothing. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves, I like plants, yes, but do these things matter? Do these things really matter to us? Because we're talking about cornfield weeds. They've always been a nuisance in crops. They've always been things that we fought against. It's one of those cases where I feel, be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it. And we've got it. And you go across the fields now. What do you see? Wheat, or rape, or barley, or whatever it is, and nothing else at all. Does this matter? Well, to me, this is part, in fact, of our background. It's part of the background of our lives. It's in the poem I've already suggested to you. Yet Shakespeare mentions the corn cockle in Coriolanus. He says, the cockle of which we have ploughed. People would have known what he was talking about. And the extinctions, the disappearance of these things, even if it's just a local extinction, seems to me diminishes us all. We are all the less for the loss of these things. And they're peculiar because they're actually ones only associated with agriculture. What would the world be once bereft of wet and of wildness? Let them be left. Oh, let them be left, wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. Manley Hopkins was writing 100 years ago. The situation is much more dire now. Thank you.